The night my son called to tell me he'd booked a week at a hunting cabin in Montana, I cried. Not because I was touched, though I told him I was. I cried because 3 days earlier, I had stood in the hallway outside my own kitchen and listened to him and his wife decide how I was going to die. Let me back up. My name is Gerald. Wait, no. I keep starting stories that way, and my late wife, Patricia, God rest her, always said I buried the lead. So let me start where it actually started, with the smell of pot roast. I'd left my reading glasses at my son's house the Sunday before. Nothing unusual. I'm 63 years old, and I leave things places. Keys, glasses, my dignity at my last prostate exam. So, on a Tuesday afternoon, I drove the 12 minutes to his place, used the spare key he gave me when they first moved in, the one he'd never asked back, and I let myself in through the side door the way I always did. The pot roast smell hit me first. My daughter-in-law was cooking, which meant she was home. I almost called out. Almost. Then I heard her voice from the kitchen, low and clipped, the way she talked on work calls when she wanted to sound like she meant business. He won't suspect anything, she was saying. That's the whole point. It comes from Nate. I stopped. Nate was my son. I stood there with my hand still on the doorframe. And you're sure the place is remote enough? A man's voice, speakerphone, slightly tinny. 4 hours from Billings, no cell service past the first 20 miles. The outfitter's the only contact. A pause. Then the man's voice again. And the outfitter understands what needs to happen. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for my legs to go cold from the knees down. Long enough to hear her say, he's 63, alone out there. Heart condition on his medical records. These things happen. I walked back out the side door. I never got my glasses. I drove to a gas station 4 blocks away and sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes. Then I called my friend Hector. Hector and I go back 31 years. We met at a job site in 1994. I was a project estimator for a mid-sized construction firm. He was running safety inspections. We fished together, attended each other's kids' graduations, buried spouses 18 months apart. He's the kind of man who, when you call him from a gas station parking lot and tell him you just heard your son's wife planning what sounds like your murder, doesn't say, "Are you sure?" He says, "Tell me exactly what she said." Word for word. I told him. There was a long silence on his end. "Okay," he finally said. "Don't go home yet. Don't call Nate. Don't call anyone else. Meet me at Denny's on Cretin." That was Tuesday. By Thursday, Hector had pulled in a favor from a former colleague, a retired county sheriff named Aldous, who now did private investigations out of a one-room office above a tax prep place in town. Aldous was 68, moved slow, and had the kind of eyes that made you feel like he'd already seen whatever you were about to show him. I liked him immediately. The three of us sat in that little office on Thursday afternoon, and I told Aldous everything. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked me 2 questions. First, had I recently changed or discussed changing my will or life insurance? Second, how much was the policy worth? The answer to both was yes, and more than I'd like to say out loud. I'd updated my estate documents 8 months earlier after a minor health scare, a blocked artery that turned out to be manageable but scared me enough to get my affairs in order. My son was the primary beneficiary on my life insurance, $2.5 million. The house, the savings, the investment accounts, all of it flowed through him. My daughter-in-law would have known this. She handled their finances with the same tight efficiency she applied to everything else. Aldous didn't whistle or shake his head. He just wrote something in his notepad. "The cabin booking," he said. How did it come about? I thought back. Nate had called me on a Sunday morning, warm and relaxed the way he'd been lately. Warmer than usual, actually, now that I thought about it. He said he'd been worried about me since Patricia died. Said I needed to get out of the house, that a week in the Montana wilderness would do me good. He'd found an outfitter who ran solo guided hunting trips, said he'd already paid for it, that all I had to do was show up. I'd been genuinely moved. I'd told him so. Aldous asked for the outfitter's name and contact information. Nate had emailed me a confirmation with all the details. I forwarded it to Aldous on the spot. "Don't cancel," Aldous said. "Don't change anything. Go." I looked at him. You want me to walk into it. I want you to walk into it with us a step ahead. He tapped his pen on the notepad. If you cancel, they adjust. If they think you suspect something, everything goes underground and we've got nothing. But if you show up, we control what happens next. He explained the plan. It wasn't complicated, which was what made me trust it. I went home that night and sat in the house Patricia and I had shared for 27 years. I sat in her chair, the good one by the window, the one none of us ever sat in anymore out of some unspoken rule. I looked at the photograph on the mantel, Nate at 12, gap-toothed and sunburned, holding up a base he caught at Lake Mead. I remembered being proud of him that day, in a way that felt almost embarrassing. The way parents get proud of small things, private things, things no one else would understand. I didn't sleep that night. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name. It's not like losing someone to death, where the loss is total and the shape of it, at least, is familiar. This was more like watching someone become a stranger while they were still standing in front of you. I kept cycling back to moments. Nate calling after Patricia's funeral. Voice raw. Nate driving me to my cardiology appointments last spring. Nate. Trying to find where it had turned and coming up empty. I eventually stopped looking. Some questions don't have answers that help you. The week before the trip, I did 4 things. First, I met with my attorney and revised my will. The life insurance beneficiary stayed the same. Changing it would raise flags. But the estate documents were restructured. If I died under any circumstances that were later determined to be non-natural, a secondary clause would activate and everything would pass to a charitable trust I'd set up years earlier for a youth trade program at a community college. My attorney, a steady woman named Patricia, which struck me as a universe's idea of a joke, asked no questions beyond the legal ones. Good attorneys don't. Second, I called Nate and told him I was excited about the trip. I told him I'd been looking at hunting gear online. I asked him if the outfitter would supply ammunition or if I should bring my own. He sounded genuinely pleased. Easy, relaxed, good at this. Third, Hector drove up to Montana 4 days ahead of me. He had a cover story. Old army buddy doing a solo camping trip in the same general region. He made contact with the outfitter company under a different name and booked a single-day guided hike. This let him get eyes on the location, on the staff, on the layout. He called me from a landline at a motel outside Billings. There's a second guy, he said, name's not on the main staff roster. Showed up the day after my inquiry. Youngish, 30-something. Drives a black pickup with Idaho plates. Your outfitter introduced him as a seasonal assistant. That's him, I said. Probably. Aldous is running the plates now. The 4th thing I did was call Nate one more time 2 nights before I was set to leave. I told him I loved him. He said it back without hesitating. I said I was grateful, that this trip was exactly what I needed, that his mother would have loved that he thought of it. He got quiet for a moment. She would have, he said. And then softer. Have a good trip, Dad. I hung up and sat with that for a long time. The drive to the cabin took me through country that Patricia always wanted to see, and we never got around to visiting. Big sky in every direction, the kind that makes you feel simultaneously small and expanded. I drove with the windows cracked, even though it was cold. I wanted to feel it. The outfitter's base camp was a cluster of log structures at the end of a gravel road. The main guide, a weathered man in his 50s, who went by the name Les, shook my hand and walked me through the schedule. 4 days of elk hunting in the backcountry, meals at the main lodge, optional fly fishing on day 3. All of it sounded exactly like what Nate had described. The seasonal assistant was introduced to me that first evening as the guide for day 2's remote sector. His name, he said, was Trent. He had a handshake like a job interview and eyes that tracked too carefully. I smiled at him the way you smile at someone when you want them to think you're slightly simple. Easy to underestimate. Harmless. Looking forward to it, I said. That night, in the cabin, I sent a prearranged text to Hector. One word. He was parked 11 miles down the main road with Aldous and a deputy from the county sheriff's office. A contact Aldous had called in a personal favor to bring on board. I was not entirely alone in the wilderness. That mattered more than I can explain. Day 1 passed without incident. Les took me out at dawn. We tracked through timber country for 6 hours. I didn't fire a shot and didn't need to. The landscape was extraordinary. I kept thinking Patricia would have made me stop every 20 feet to photograph something. Day 2. Trent came for me at 5:30 in the morning, earlier than scheduled. I was already awake. We drove his pickup deep into the backcountry on a fire road that wasn't on the map Les had given me. I noted this without saying anything. When he parked and we started hiking, I let him set the pace and fell into step behind him. We walked for about 40 minutes. The terrain dropped into a creek drainage, steep on both sides. He stopped at a spot where the bank narrowed and the water ran fast and shallow over rocks. "Good area for elk to water," he said, not really looking at me, scanning the tree line. "I'm sure it is," I said. He turned then, and I saw the calculation in his face shift. Something decided. I took a breath. "Before we go any further," I said, "I want you to know that everything since I arrived has been recorded. Audio and GPS. My location has been tracked since I left the main camp. There are 2 men and a county deputy about 2 miles from here." Trent went very still. "I heard the phone call," I said, 3 weeks ago. "I heard your arrangement with my daughter-in-law. I know what I'm here for." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You can't prove anything." "The phone record's from her burner," I said. "The Idaho plates on your truck are registered to an LLC that traces back to a man with 2 prior fraud convictions. The Venmo transfer from an account she thought was private." I paused. Aldous is thorough. Something went out of Trent's face. Not guilt. Men like that don't carry guilt the way you'd recognize it. More like calculation failing and finding nothing behind it. He sat down on a rock. Actually sat down on a rock. Actually sat down. "She said it would be clean," he said, mostly to himself. "They always think it'll be clean," I said. Hector and Aldous reached us 14 minutes later. The deputy had paperwork. Trent was cooperative in the way that men are cooperative when they've already done the math and don't like the sum. My daughter-in-law was arrested at our office that afternoon. My son, and this is the part I still don't fully know what to do with, was brought in for questioning. What Aldous and the investigators eventually determined was that she had acted largely without his knowledge, that Nate had genuinely believed the cabin trip was a gift, that she had arranged everything through Trent, a man she'd met through a contact from her previous job, without telling my son what she was actually paying for. I don't know if that makes it better. I've turned it over and over, and I'm not sure it does. Nate called me from the police station. His voice was the voice of a man I didn't recognize. He kept saying he didn't know, he swore he didn't know, and I kept saying I know, I know, I know, because I did know, or at least I believed him, and believing him was the only thing I had left to hold on to. My daughter-in-law was charged with solicitation to commit murder and conspiracy. Trent faced the same charges, plus additional counts related to his prior record. The proceedings took almost a year to work through. I attended as much of it as I could stomach. I updated my estate documents again after the arrest, this time thoroughly. The life insurance policy was restructured. The charitable trust I'd set up for the trade program became the primary beneficiary. What was left to Nate was real but modest, enough to matter, not enough to motivate anything. My attorney nodded as she typed. "Nate and I still speak. Not like before, and I won't pretend otherwise. There's a version of a father-son relationship we used to have that is gone, and I don't think grieving it serves either of us. What we have now is something more careful. Sunday calls, occasional dinners, a kind of wary tenderness that I suspect is the best we can manage, and on some days I think maybe it's enough. Hector still drives out every couple months. We fish when the weather allows. He never says I told you so, which is one of many reasons I've kept him in my life for 31 years. Sometimes I think about that creek drainage in Montana, the fast water over the rocks, the way Trent sat down on that rock like all the air had left him at once. I think about the photograph on my mantle, gap-toothed Nate at 12 with the base at Lake Mead. I think about Patricia in her chair by the window. I don't know what you do with a story like this. You can't tie it up. You can't make it mean something clean. What I know is that I'm 63 years old. I'm still here, and on balance, that's not nothing. I survived it. That's where I start, and most days, that's enough to go on. I still think about that creek drainage in Montana sometimes. The fast water, the cold air sitting low in the drainage, the way Trent just sat down on that rock when he realized it was over. like something left him all at once. People ask me what I felt in that moment. I don't think they expect the answer I give them, which is not much, not triumph, not rage. Something quieter than either of those. Maybe just the recognition that choices, eventually, catch up to the people who make them, not because the universe is tidy, or because there's some invisible ledger being kept somewhere. Just because actions have weight, and weight, given enough time, land somewhere. My daughter-in-law made a choice. She looked at a 63-year-old widower who trusted her completely, who had welcomed her into his family, who had sat at her dinner table and eaten her pot roast, and meant it when he said it was good, and she chose to treat his life as an obstacle. That choice didn't fail because she got unlucky. It failed because I paid attention. Because I didn't panic. Because I didn't panic. Because I found people I trusted and we thought it through carefully before we moved. That's the part I want to sit with for a moment, because I think it matters. When I walked out of my son's house that Tuesday afternoon with my legs gone cold and my mind spinning, the easiest thing in the world would have been to fall apart. To call my son in a panic? To call the police without any real evidence? To let fear make my decisions for me? Fear is loud. It crowds out everything else if you let it. What I've learned, what that experience pressed into me in a way I won't forget, is that clarity is a choice you have to make on purpose. Hector didn't say, calm down. He said, tell me exactly what she said, word for word. That's a man asking you to think. And thinking, when everything in you wants to react, is probably the hardest and most important thing a person can do. I was also asked more than once, after everything settled, whether I was bitter, whether I felt like I'd lost something that couldn't be recovered, and the honest answer is yes, something was lost. The version of my son I thought I knew, the family dinners I thought were real, a kind of innocence about my own situation that I can't get back. Those things are gone. But here's what I kept, myself. My judgment. The friendships that held when they were tested. The ability to look at a hard thing clearly and walk through it without becoming someone I didn't recognize. Nate and I are still finding our way. It's slow. Some Sundays are easier than others. I don't know if we'll ever get back to something that feels uncomplicated, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing. What I do know is that I'd rather have a careful, honest relationship with my son than a comfortable one built on something that was never quite real. Hector came out last month. We fished for 3 hours and didn't catch anything worth keeping. On the drive back, he said, "You doing all right?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so." And I meant it. I survived. I paid attention. I didn't quit when quitting would have been easier. That's where I start when I think about what this whole thing cost me and what it gave me back. And most days, the math comes out in my favor.